In 2002, the North Korean government announced plans to open up this region of the country. It would have a free market with international access and most importantly, the potential for democratic government. Okay, how in the world did this happen? I mean, North Korea is supposed to be a self-sufficient workers' paradise, so why would they pollute their country with the evils of capitalism? Listen, around this time, North Korea had just experienced one of the worst famines in human history. Their economy basically collapsed after the Soviet Union fell apart, and natural disasters and international sanctions kind of sealed their fate. Then in 2001, Kim Jong-il, who was the supreme leader at the time, visited Shanghai. Now, like 40 years earlier, China was in a pretty similar state, but then these two guys came into power and did a bunch of reforms. They established 14 open coastal cities in 1984 and created a bunch of special economic zones throughout the 80s and 90s that ushered in a number of free market policies. As we all know, this sped up the Chinese economy like crazy, and the epicenter of this growth was Shanghai. Okay, so how do you think Kim reacted when he went on his trip? As you could have guessed, he was flabbergasted, but he honestly had every right to be. The transformation of Shanghai was legitimately crazy, and it led to Kim calling the policy of openness and reform a correct one. That is a crazy thing for the leader of a North Korea to say. Most importantly though, the development in China provided a direct blueprint for economic prosperity in North Korea, and Kim went home determined to replicate that success, but he needed to bring in some help first. One of the things he was most impressed by in China were the greenhouses, since they allowed for year-round farming and could be the answer to North Korea's food shortages. He learned that they were developed by this guy, so he made his goons contact him. They were like, hey man, Kim Jong-il wants you to come build a greenhouse. He was like, sorry, who is this? The North Koreans. The government of North Korea wants me specifically to build one greenhouse? Yeah. And you really just can't pass that up, so he did, and Kim Jong-il was like, holy shit. He took him aside and was like, that was the coolest thing I've ever seen. Really? What if we build something even bigger? Like what? Listen, I've been looking at China with their crazy cities. I say we relax all this communism stuff for a bit and build something better. Okay, the communist government of North Korea wants me specifically to develop a capitalist city in North Korea. Yes. Even more capitalist than China. Yes. I'm so in. This was an incredibly ambitious plan for like the most communist nation of all time, but before we talk about that, we need to talk about this guy because he's probably like the funniest possible guy for the job. Yang Bin here is a Chinese Dutch billionaire, so you know, already some ideological differences there, but he was totally ready to make some crazy business moves. When North Korea asked him to do this, they had to decide on a location, obviously, so they chose this city because it's right by China, and then they were like, hooray, let's put it there. But then he was like, no, let's make it 3 times larger. They were like, okay, I guess. And then they had to decide how the city was governed, and the plan so far was to just copy the cities in China. But then he was like, what if we copy Hong Kong? Now this was extremely ballsy for a few reasons. The special economic zones in China can be pretty flexible in regards to trade, since they usually have lower taxes and less regulations compared to the rest of the country. Nonetheless, they're still directly under the control of the Chinese government. On the other hand, Hong Kong, which is under a special administrative region, had their own law with their own currency. Obviously, things have changed since then, but this is how things were 20 years ago. That meant if North Korea accepted Yang's proposals, the region would have its own passport, flag, and basic law. Basically, aside from foreign policy and defense, sinuiju would be making their own decisions. Now, they actually had to think about this one since North Korea likes to, you know, be pretty hands-on with things, but believe it or not, they actually agreed. Yang won them over by simply stating that Hong Kong and Macau, which was another SAR, were the most economically successful Chinese cities. And they were at the time, so it was official. North Korea was getting their own Hong Kong. Now they just had to actually make it. Nobody in North Korea really knew how to make this kind of government, so they actually got a bunch of lawyers from Hong Kong to write the basic law of the SAR. Because of that, it was somewhat similar to the law of Hong Kong. The city would be an international business hub with its own government and pretty minimal involvement from the central North Korean government. There would be private property and free trade. Residents would have freedoms of expression, press, assembly, strike, and association. They could even vote for a democratically elected legislative council. In North Korea, this is crazy. There would be a governor directly appointed by the North Korean government, and there was also probably some room for some, you know, funky interpretation, but any attempt at reform by the North Korean government is significant. This governor position would be held by Yang Bin, since he was the main guy planning the whole thing, and once he got appointed, he started announcing what the zone would actually look like. Firstly, hundreds of thousands of people currently living in the zone would have to move out so they could demolish most of what was already there. This was so they could build a new city modeled after Shenzhen in China. He also announced that the US dollar would become the official currency of the zone, which is pretty awesome. Most importantly, all foreigners could enter the zone without a visa, including South Koreans. Above all, though, North Korea finally officially announced that the SAR and its laws will come into effect on September 30th, 2002. After over 50 years, North Korea would finally enact reforms with the potential of greatly accelerating their economic development. But then September 30th passed and nothing really happened, so the press were like, hey man, what's going on? And Yang was like, everything's fine, guys. The government just wasn't comfortable letting in South Koreans that easily, so we're gonna do what China and Taiwan do for their nationals, and it's gonna be great. Also, they're still working on the fence that separates sinuiju from the rest of the country, but they're going fast on that. Aside from those two things, everything is going to plan. And it probably was, but then like 4 days later, Yang got arrested by Chinese authorities for tax evasion and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. This was probably expected from the guy who managed to become a billionaire in a communist country, but come on, man. Also, there's theories that the Chinese didn't even care about his tax evasion and only arrested him because they were scared sinuiju would steal foreign capital from northeast China. I guess this kind of goes to show that this project did legitimately have some serious potential. Either way, the North Koreans were like, shoot. Remember, Yang was the guy planning literally everything, and let me tell you, these guys do not know a single thing about capitalism. So everyone was like, we should probably get another guy and then get the show on the road again, but then they just kind of kept getting preoccupied. Apparently the former mayor of Fullerton, California was gonna lead the project in 2004, which is kind of weird, but then that never happened, and after a while everyone was like, okay, this is not gonna happen. But they were still trying, kind of. They kept trying to make a joint economic zone with China on this weird, terrible island by sinuiju, but that never really went anywhere. Then in 2013, they started working on the Sinuiju International Economic Zone, but they didn't really redevelop a lot. Then in 2018, this weird circle building started rising up over the river, which looks kind of cool actually. Then they built this big new bridge to China and then forgot to actually connect it to a road for like 7 years. Then Kim Jong-un started actually looking at plans for the city, but he never did anything with them. Basically, they just kind of keep planning stuff and then it never really works out. But imagine if Yang Bin wasn't arrested and they actually carried out the original plan. I'm not qualified to talk about any of this, but that kind of seems like the start of a giant domino effect. North Korea might not have even been around today if this project succeeded, but it's North Korea, so they probably would have found another way to not do it. Anywho, moral of the story, pay your taxes because they will get you.